I was born on the prairies where the wind blew free, and there was nothing to break the light of the sun. I was born where there were no enclosures. Geronimo. When Geronimo and his warriors surrendered for the last time in Arizona in 1886, they were put on an eastbound train. During a quick stop for a trial at Fort Sam Houston, Geronimo and his men were sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. The women and children had been sent ahead to Fort Augustine, Florida, but the government, instead of honoring their promise that Apache families would be together, sent the men to Fort Pickens, Florida. A few years later, the women rejoined the men at Fort Pickens. During this time, the government was forced to admit the climate in Florida was too wet, humid, and mosquito-infested for Apaches, and too many people in the Chiricahua band were dying. Perhaps no one would have noticed the Apache population was rapidly declining in a damp and moldy Floridian prison if it weren't for the fact Geronimo had become very popular with photographers, newspapermen, and authors who wrote stories about the great Apache and had turned Geronimo into a Western folk hero. The government decided to send the Apaches to Mount Vernon, Alabama, in the hope of lessening the rapidly increasing death rate, but that climate also was unsuitable for the same reasons as Fort Pickens. Even before the Apaches were sent to Alabama, it had been abandoned by white people as unlivable. It became clear that the damp and mosquito-infested environment was unlivable for anyone when the death rate for Apaches continued to climb. In a last-ditch effort to save what was left of the Chiricahua Apache band and avoid a public relations disaster, Geronimo and his band were sent to Fort Sill Indian Reservation in Oklahoma. Ostensibly, the government hoped the dry climate would be healthier for Apaches, and, they hoped, get the old war chief, Geronimo, away from the heavily populated eastern coast. At Fort Sill, he would be less visible to curious tourists and not so accessible to the press. It didn't work. The public fever for anything Geronimo, created by books, magazines, and newspapers, followed him to Oklahoma. In 1886, when Geronimo surrendered, the Chiricahua Apaches were the last Indians in America to move to a reservation. In 1894, when he and his small band of Chiricahua Apaches stepped off the train at Fort Sill Indian Reservation, they were greeted by all the other tribes already captive. At this point, it is worthwhile to mention Geronimo didn't speak English, and his knowledge of Spanish was disputed by many. This left the Army, anthropologists, and newspapermen dependent upon the mercy of interpreters, some better than others. Apaches soon learned this prison camp was located in a miserable location in southwest Oklahoma, near the Oklahoma-Texas border. The dry land was barely habitable and most suited for snakes, spiders, scorpions, and other bothersome and poisonous creatures inhabiting the land long before the soldiers and Indians raised their tents and teepees. The summer weather was hot. Temperatures often soared over 100 degrees. In the winter, fingers of icy cold winds blew across the flat plains. Nothing could inhibit the power of these storms. In addition to their weather woes, water in the area was scarce and not always potable. Fort Sill, built before sanitation procedures were well known in the West, had its own problems. For years, an open trench running through the middle of the Army post contained the camp's raw sewage. Ridding the camp of its waste by this method was likely responsible for many troops and their families contracting serious illnesses, including cholera, diphtheria, and malaria. It was no wonder men assigned to guard the tribes were almost as miserable as the indigenous peoples. It was at this place, in this time, Geronimo, an Apache war leader and shaman, struggled to save what was left of his people along with other tribal leaders and their members who shared the prison camp. Even though there wasn't much to laugh about on the Fort Sill Indian Reservation, it is known Geronimo had a sense of humor. I think he would approve of this historical fantasy. Janelle Meraz Hooper.